After spending January in Australia and February in New Zealand, on February 28th, I departed Christchurch for Singapore at 6 o'clock in the morning. But with a layover in Sydney, I didn't arrive in Singapore until rush hour, which was pretty heavy. The long cab ride into the heart of the city, I learned from the cab driver that pretty much everyone here speaks English. There's a lot of different languages spoken at home: Mandarin, Cantonese, Malay, probably the principal among those. Isn't surprising that English is sort of a common language since it was a colony of Britain until 1963. There was no walking tour available the following day until the afternoon, so the next morning I did some exploring on my own. I found it to be a really clean, organized city, good public transportation with some very interesting architecture, like the Marina Bay Sands Hotel. I took this photo from on top of the Capita Springs building, whose biggest tenant is JP Morgan. Singapore is a big financial center in Asia. On the walking tour, we saw plenty of reminders of the British colonial days. The guide said chewing gum was outlawed in Singapore, as is smoking, but you did see a few smokers here and there. I took a pass on the gruel, and after a couple of days in Singapore, it was on to Ho Chi Minh City. On Friday, March 3rd, I landed in Vietnam. I had bought a package tour for the Vietnam, Cambodia, and Laos part of my trip because I didn't want to be driving in those countries. And I'm glad I did. Traffic is insane there. The tour company had sent a driver to take me to the hotel, and I think he drove around in circles for about a half hour because we kept passing the same KFC. My tour didn't start until Sunday, so I took in some local rock and roll on Saturday night. The first day of the tour, we started with the Cu Chi Tunnels, a 75-mile network of tunnels just outside of Ho Chi Minh City that were used heavily by the Viet Cong, especially during the Tet Offensive to attack troops. They would hide in these tunnels during the day, then come out at night, attack, and then back in. Tunnels were really small. Even our guide couldn't fit. He said Vietnamese were a lot smaller back then. They widened one so us fat American tourists could go down and crawl, which I did for about 50 yards, and that was enough for me. The Viet Cong women dug these out pretty much cup by cup. A very determined bunch. They also had an exhibit of some pretty gruesome booby traps that they manufactured mostly from shells that we had dropped on them. It was sad to hear how they dehumanized our troops. You know, I always consider them just older guys from our neighborhood in what they refer to as the American War. I remember some of these booby traps from the John Wayne Green Beret movie and thinking, that's a place I don't want to go. That afternoon, we toured the War Remnants Museum, which is mostly outside anyway, captured equipment that they took after the fall of Saigon. Inside was the history of the war, actually financed by a lot of foundations from here in the U.S. You know, it included all the famous photos from that war. We finished the day by visiting the Ho Chi Minh City Post Office, which our guide said was famous because it was designed by Eiffel of Eiffel Tower fame. But I learned out later that that was not true. It was actually another architect that designed this post office. And the next morning, we headed towards the Mekong Delta. Our first stop was what our guide called the largest pagoda in the world. After his statement on the Eiffel architect, I wasn't so sure, but they were very large Buddha statues, and there were a lot of Buddhists from other countries like Thailand and China visiting this pagoda. That afternoon, we took a boat ride out to an island in the middle of the Mekong Delta, and we took this short little boat ride. They said to tip our rowers, so after I gave ours a whopping 25 cents, they made me wear this hat. They also made me eat this nasty looking tilapia for lunch. The next day, I flew to Hanoi. My tour company offers at least 20 different tours of Southeast Asia, depending on what you wanted to see. Mine was a bit unique because I wanted to see Luang Prabang and Laos. But as a result, the tour operator had to shuffle me among his other tours, and I ended up with a different group pretty much every day of my tour. The first stop was the Ho Chi Minh Mausoleum. Our guide said it would be a long wait, and it was better to do it in the morning since it was cooler then. I was really surprised at how many kids were lining up to go inside. It must be something required to visit every year that you're in school. But they were a lot of fun practicing their English with me. We really never got past, "How are you? I'm fine." But it made the 2 hours go by quicker. And once inside, I mean, Ho Chi Minh is pretty well preserved. They got him involved, but for having been dead for 50 years, he didn't look bad. That afternoon, we visited some cultural places like the President's House and various temples. Unfortunately, the Hanoi Hilton, where John McCain was imprisoned with others, just like the old U.S. Embassy in Saigon, had been demolished. The next morning, I took a 3 hour bus ride from Hanoi out to Halong Bay. This was one of the highlights of the tour. I got my own cabin on the boat, which looked a lot better on the inside than the outside. We had a 2 hour cruise out to the middle of the bay, passing a lot of these limestone mountains rising out of what was really very clear, clean water. We overnighted on the ship, and then the next morning we did some kayaking and a little swimming before returning to our hotel back in Hanoi. The next day was a 3 hour bus ride from Hanoi out to the countryside. It was good to get out of crazy Hanoi and into some fresh air. They took us on a hike. The only other people on my tour group were these two girls from France. They had spent a year working in Australia and decided to spend some of that cash on this trip before returning to France. I must not have been a very good guest because the hotel staff did this happy dance as I was checking out. After spending the night in the country, it was back to crazy Hanoi. I had a free day, so I spent it wandering through the markets. The quality of the mostly counterfeit items was pretty bad, and I didn't really have room in my luggage, so the only thing I bought was a baseball hat. The next day, I flew from Hanoi to Siem Reap in Cambodia. And because of all the tourist sites nearby, Siem Reap had a lot of Western type restaurants. I had a dinner at a Greek taverna. The next day, I discovered I had a tour group of one. It was just me, the guide, and the driver. Hmm, could it be my breath? Anyway, the first stop was Angkor Wat. And as we approached, you could see it's surrounded by this huge moat with a perimeter of about 3 miles. It was built back in the 1200s, originally a Hindu shrine, but then it kind of moved back and forth between a Hindu shrine and a Buddhist shrine as the different rulers changed. It was abandoned back in the 1400s, but rediscovered in the 1800s. I was a little disappointed because I was thinking it was still sort of covered a lot by jungle, but as you can see, they've pretty much cleaned the whole thing up. But it turns out the images I had in my head regarding trees growing out of the ruins that I must have seen in some documentary on PBS, wherever, were actually from another nearby temple called Ta Prohm. These rulers really like building temples because they're dotted all over this part of Cambodia. By the time I left Southeast Asia, I pretty much had my fill of temples. A lot of relics here, as you can see. The last temple of the day was Angkor Thom, which was also the largest, covering about 10 square kilometers. Saw a lot of stone reliefs and carved faces. A lot have been washed away, though, over the years. Ran into that murderous thug, Pol Pot, who ran afoul of the Buddhists, and his afterlife now is eternally scrounging for scraps at the temple. The next day, March 18th, I flew from Siem Reap to the Laos city of Luang Prabang. Where Siem Reap had several Western restaurants, Luang Prabang had none. The tourists were mostly religious Buddhists from China and Thailand, and as you can see here, the local monks travel the streets at 5:30 every morning collecting alms from the tourists and the locals. Mostly it's just sticky rice. You can see everyone there had their phones out recording this. I had the day free, so I went to the gym, which was surprisingly modern and well equipped, and then visited the local markets. Here I am in the tuk tuk. Once again, it was just me on this tour, so the guide took me to the local monastery where the monks were doing some rehab. The guide said that most boys spend a year or two in the monastery, but just a few stay beyond that. We then went to a Hmong village. The Hmong are a minority that sided with the CIA against the commies back in the 70s and were persecuted. A lot now live in Wisconsin and Minnesota. These two girls said if I liked bagpipes, I'd really love this next act. Okay. I wasn't as rude to the musician as Katie and Beth here. We then went to lunch, and in the afternoon we drove up to this waterfall and swimming pond. This was one of the must-sees and must-dos, so I had brought my swimming trunks and I took a dip. The mountain water was pretty cold, but very refreshing on a hot day. The next morning, we took a 3-hour boat ride down the Mekong River. As you can see, it was just me again, the guide and the boat driver. I think the tour company must have lost money on me because if you consider just me on these tours and then the airfares, the tickets to all these different temples and such, I can't think that they made any money. Our destination on this river trip was the Pak Ao Caves, which back before Buddhism came to Laos, the locals used to make this a shrine to the river spirits. But since then, it's become sort of a depository for damaged Buddhist statues from locals as well as tourists. It's a way to get rid of your statue without throwing it away. It was a lot cooler inside the cave. As you can see here, a lot of statues, over 3,000, and not only Buddhas, but other types of statues. And I ran into one of the few Americans that I ran into on this trip. A family from Utah was visiting. The next day, I started headed my way back home to Chicago. I decided to break it into two legs and spend a couple of nights in Dubai to rest up. There was a stopover in Bangkok for like 8 hours. So I looked up a friend of mine, Fred, who had married a Thai woman when posted to Bangkok, and he met me at the airport for a couple of beers and some lunch. Then got to Dubai. The next day, went to the largest mall in the world and found this very unique White Sox hat, which I'll be wearing to the World Series. And then after that, it was back to Terminal 5 in Chicago, where the trip all started.